Welcome to another Down the Rabbit Hole video. There's a new Atari 2600 flashback console that's coming out pretty soon, and also a brand new flashback portable, much like this one, which I got about 6 months ago. And there's also a new Sega Genesis flashback console, and I thought to myself, that reminds me of this, a little flashback portable of the Sega Genesis console, a console in your pocket, so to speak. And I know people have talked about these things at length. I don't really want to do a review per se because I'm just repeating what other people have said. But there's some neat little stories that have been connected to these two machines that I wanted to bring up, and I thought, well, maybe I should introduce these little handhelds to begin with. So I thought, well, what might be interesting is if I actually compare and contrast the two. Now, comparing an Atari 2600 versus a Sega Genesis is a little bit apples and oranges, but I thought since the form factor on both of these little handhelds is very, very similar, it might be kind of interesting to see what does one console do better than the other, or vice versa. So that's what I'm going to do here. Now, I did a video response to Ben over at T-Rex Space Station a few months ago where I talked about one of the particular games on this, the flashback portable for the Atari 2600. And as part of that video response, I did say, well, I was going to do an unboxing, but you know what? There isn't much to unbox here, and I'll show that again. Inside, you basically have the instructions and the console, and there's a wire as well for charging it, which I have elsewhere. But inside is this, the Atari 2600 flashback. Really, really like it. Same with this, the Genesis one. So let's just do some comparisons here of the actual hardware. As you can see, they're virtually identical along the bottom. I think maybe the Genesis has a slightly curved shape to it. Yeah, I guess so. The D-pads are practically the same. I'll show those off in a second. Same button layout. Both have SD card slots inside so that you can play a lot of games. Oh, I just noticed that there is a difference here. They both have power indicator to show their stage of being charged, but the USB connector, which is the same for both, is actually on the opposite side. There's a headphone jack, USB, USB. So there are slight differences in the hardware, and then both have volume controls and the SD card slot. On the back, I noticed one big difference is the Sega Genesis handheld has the ability to unscrew and replace the battery within. Doesn't look like you can do that with the Atari 2600. And looking at the bottom, we've got our power slider button here, exactly the same on both units. I was wrong. This is actually where you plug your headphone in. This connector here is actually for hooking up to television with a little AV cable. I do have that, and I'm going to show that off toward the end of the video here. The screens are exactly the same size, and the D-pads are precisely the same one as well. And then you've got power and kind of a reset button for both systems. Speaking of the reset button, I really like the Genesis layout here, where you've got A, B, C, and X, Y, Z for those 6-button games. And I'll never forget when the Atari 2600 one was announced up here, I saw the same 6 buttons and I thought, what the heck are you going to use all the extra buttons for? The 2600 had fire, and that was it. But then, upon closer inspection, I realized, oh yeah, that's for things like reset, select, you've got your difficulty switches here. So I thought, oh, okay, it's for all those other controls that were on the front of the Atari 2600. Okay, I take it back. That does make sense. They both have the same little speaker here, but other than that, I mean, they do appear to be identical hardware. Now, let's just actually compare what the two screens are like. There's no real way this is going to come out on my camera, but I think the screens are very, very close to each other as far as the quality is concerned. What is really noticeable, though, is on the Atari 2600 menu system, it's so much more pleasing to the eye. I mean, you've got little pictures of the cartridges that go on there. I like the way each of the titles is lit up, whereas with the Genesis one, you're just kind of going down a much more rudimentary list. It's not that pleasant to look at in comparison. But now some people have commented that at least in the case of this is the Gopher down here. In the case of the Gopher, if you kind of go off angle, there's like a brightness issue that goes on where it doesn't have a wide range of viewing angle. Yeah, you can see there, they are pretty much exactly the same. Okay, there's too much reflection in that direction. But they do have kind of that same, they both ghost rather quickly. So they do both have the same kind of screen depth of field issues. So that's a little bit unfortunate. But, and I think actually it almost seems like the Atari Flashback handheld has a slightly better screen. I don't know, maybe it's like a contrast thing, but and maybe it's just because it's newer hardware. Maybe there are very, very slight differences. Looking at the two of them right now, it looks like they're almost identical, but definitely I much prefer how the layout is up on the Atari 2600. The one for the Sega Genesis is just, it's very, very rough on the eyes. Speaker-wise on the Atari 2600 one, it's all right. I mean, luckily, 2600 doesn't have the greatest sound quality to begin with. It's very serviceable. Let's try out the D-pad here. Yeah, it feels okay for the D-pad. You've got a decent amount of mushiness there. Yeah, I think that works. The speaker on the Gopher, it's okay. You know, it's also very serviceable. Let's try out that D-pad. Yeah, the D-pad's about the same. I think the D-pad on the Genesis feels a little bit stiffer, not quite as mushy. It's all right, actually. What the sort of killer app for both of these consoles or handhelds is the fact that they both have the SD card slot available at the top there. And with that, you can play all kinds of different games. You'll notice here they both have the identical Fire Core menu, so that's kind of funny. Now, I'm obviously not going to go into a lot of the different games that are on these machines, but I wanted to show some compatibility problems that both of them have. So they are both guilty of not being perfectly emulated versions of their original hardware. One difference with these SD menus I do notice that I don't like about the Atari 2600, if you play one of these games and then exit out, you're actually booted right to the very, very top of the menu, whereas at least with the Genesis one, it does remember what was the last game you were playing, and it kind of selects that back again, so that's worth noting. But now here's a big problem. This is Cosmic Arc from Imagic, one of my favorite games. I played it back in the day. It shows the exact issue of this. What's built in here is something called an Atari on a chip. And Cosmic Arc used a cool little trick for making the star field in the background behind this UFO work. And my Atari Flashback 2 that I got years ago, and many of the different flashbacks that have come out in all these years, they have a problem with Cosmic Arc. They cannot replicate the star field that should be in the background. But the Genesis handheld also has an emulation problem. As you can see, I'm getting a little indicator my power's getting low. We'll talk about battery life in a second. But if I try Ms. Pac-Man here, now if you're playing Ms. Pac-Man with a 6-button controller, you can actually use these 4 buttons as your directions. You can use the D-pad, but I always find using these is a little more, I don't know, a little more comfortable, a little better ergonomics for me, and they don't work with the handheld version of Ms. Pac-Man. So yes, I can use this D-pad here, which is fine, although I find it doesn't seem to work very well, and she seems to want to go off to the right on her own there without much, see, it's like she's stuck. She always wants to go to the right. So that's not so good. And as I say, in theory, you should be able to use these buttons, but again, she gets stuck in one direction. She doesn't want to respond to these at all. So that's something I've looked up. It's definitely an emulation problem that this Genesis on a chip has. It just doesn't work with Miss Pac-Man. So now, just to prove to you that the 6-button configuration does work with some titles, if I load up the Williams Arcade Collection and go to Robotron here, you'll briefly see it'll say something about 6-button configuration. That means it detects this as a 6-button Genesis controller, and you can use these as your 4 cardinal directions for shooting. So move a D-pad and move and shoot with these, kind of like the original control scheme of this twin-stick shooter. Is this a much better way to play Robotron? Now in that last gameplay there, you probably heard how scratchy the sounds were. Both of these consoles are pretty guilty of that. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to hook them both up to the TV using a little AV cable here into that connector at the top that I showed you. Before I do, though, I just wanted to talk about battery life. Even though this thing is showing that it needs to be charged, I have used this thing on long trips. Like, I actually took this to the UK last summer, and we were gone for a full month and never had to charge it up once. I mean, it uses just a standard USB connection, but I just thought, rather than take anything that's going to need a lot of charging up, these are very low power requirement games. Same with the Atari games. So the ion lithium battery that's inside here, it'll last you weeks and weeks and weeks if you're playing it somewhat regularly. This just hasn't been used for a while, so that's why the battery is getting low there. But I'm very, very happy with how long these things do last with their battery. All right, so as I said, let's take the AV cables that I've got here. Now, this is just a standard set that you would get for hooking up. You know, it's got the, 3.5 millimeter there and RCA on this side. Basically, you just plug that into that top connection there on both of these units, and these into your AV on your TV. Now, at first I thought it might be a case of, I think people have posted it's red goes into the video and then black goes into the audio. Turns out I was the other way around. So I just labeled these things. This goes to red for your audio and this goes to yellow for your video. Let's plug it into the TV and we'll do some comparisons of what these things are sounding like on a real television set. So let's fire up the Atari portable. As you can see, this screen doesn't turn on at all, but what we have is the same menu here. And it looks not bad. The text is a little garbled. It's okay. Considering it's upscaling what was built for this tiny screen, it looks all right. Let's fire up a quick game of adventure here. Looks okay, quite doable. The key is ever so slightly off looking, like it's got a little bit of staircasing involved. It's doable though. Yorgel himself is a little bit rough around the edges too, but not bad. Other than that though, I do have to say most of the graphics look fine when upscaled to the TV. It's quite a nice way to play actually. Now, what everybody always gives at games, the folks who make both of these portables a lot of flack about, is the fact that the sound or the music emulation is really, really poor. So I just want to briefly touch on that. I think for the Atari 2600, the only game that I think will really test the sound or music capabilities is going to be Pressure Cooker, one of my favorites. Well, it sounds good. Yeah, that sounds fine. Ooh, however, having said that, that does not look fine over there. Yikes. Yeah, that's something worth noting. You see here, there's like this weird rainbowy thing going on. A lot of the original ROMs don't play nicely with the handheld, so you need to actually get specific versions of some of these ROMs in order for it to work. Which is a whole other story, and something that definitely, I guess I've messed that one up, something that others have talked about. But as far as the sound, the music emulation goes, Pressure Cooker sounds fine. The notorious problem with the music and sound for the Genesis portable is Sonic the Hedgehog. Anybody who's hooked that thing up will tell you it sounds awful. So let's do a comparison. Now, I don't actually own Sonic the Hedgehog. You'd think that's crazy, but I don't. I've talked about that in my video response to Gruss Newton, who is a huge Sonic fan. I just never really got into Sonic the Hedgehog myself, so I don't own it, but I do have an original Xbox, which does have the Sonic collection on it. So let's assume this Xbox version of Sonic the Hedgehog is 100% accurate. Let's have a quick listen to the music. That sounds right to me. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's see what the Genesis handheld is like. Alright, moment of truth. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh, that is painful. Yeah. Oh yeah. Ouch. Yeah, not being a Sonic fan, I didn't have that on here before, but now that I hear it, woo! Ouch. Make it stop. Yeah, definitely the Sega, at least the Gopher here, which is 5 years old, it suffers the very, very painful sound music problem. So, and from what I gather, the latest Genesis flashback console, like the one that looks like a little Genesis you still plug into your TV with HDMI, that also has the same sound problem. So that's been causing a lot of discussion. Yeah, wow, I didn't realize how bad that was. I will say, I like most of the other games I've got loaded on here. I mean, they talk about Street Fighter 2 is very, very hard to listen to. I find it's perfectly doable, and the D-pad's actually not too bad for it. But in conclusion, the Atari one is actually perfectly fine. So I have to say, I'm actually, for a comparison video, I'm really impressed that the Atari one doesn't seem to have the same sound problems as this one. It does have other problems with games, as you saw with Pressure Cooker, though. Alright, in conclusion, so I've got both consoles here, and they're both running Pitfall. This is the original 2600 code from Activision, and this is the secret game that I've mentioned before, that if you put a certain code into Pitfall, the Mayan Adventure on the Sega Genesis, you can unlock original Pitfall. I've played a little bit of both, just to give everything a final comparison. The D-pads are practically the same. I will say that the one on the Atari portable is ever so slightly looser or lighter on the, like you can push it and it's got a little bit more give. This is a little bit stiff, but you know what? In some cases you actually want that. What I really do notice now that I've played an identical game on both handhelds is the buttons on the 2600 are nicer. They're softer, they're a little more mushy. These are pretty firm and tough, but maybe you want that if that's the particular style of gamer that you are. But anyway, I just thought that would be an interesting little comparison of the two handhelds. They are very, very different machines as to what's running inside there, but it's amazing that such identical pieces of hardware have such varying different performances. I may very well end up getting that Atari flashback that's coming out, the one that hooks up to high definition. I'm really very pleased with what AtGames is doing with that, and I'm thinking if they could just add an SD card, man, I'd be all over that. The Genesis, now again, being not a Sonic fan, I'm pretty happy with this handheld. This pretty much serves all of my purposes. I was going to show you Star Control. I talked about that ages ago as well on Genesis. That's a game where it has very fine little dots and things. You have to keep track of your fuel and your crew. But I just thought, well, this video is getting long enough, and honestly, this does work quite well with that. Maybe I'll do a separate video for Star Control. Anyway, so yeah, in conclusion, really like both these handhelds, and for such identical looking bits of plastic as far as the outer casing is concerned, they are very different inside. I just thought that little comparison video might be kind of interesting or handy for somebody who's thinking of getting one of these kind of devices. All right, well, until next time, we'll see you down the rabbit hole.